Good evening, and thank you for being here. It was October 8th, 2015. My sister Lisa and I had just completed an emotional evening commemorating the 30th anniversary of the murder of our father, Leon Klinghoffer, aboard the Achille Lauro. It was also the night we dedicated the Klinghoffer Archive here at the American Jewish Historical Society. As the audience gathered itself to leave, Julie Solomon, our very good friend from the Village Temple, approached us. She wanted to tell us how exceptional she thought the program was, how much she learned, and how much of an impact it made on her. A few days later, Julie asked if the three of us could go out for coffee. We made arrangements to meet, and as we were catching up, making small talk, Julie sheepishly said she had something to ask us. And for those of you who know Julie, sheepish is not an adjective I would use to describe her. I was wondering, she asked, if you ever thought of writing a book? She went on to say, I feel there is a richness to your story. There's so much there. There's so much from which we can learn. She added she understood if we weren't interested.
Little did we know at the time, she had already had a little conversation with my husband, Jerry Arbitier, who encouraged her to approach us. After a family discussion, we thought a book would further our mother Marilyn's mission to educate the world about terrorism, and so that our father's murder would not have been in vain. And Julie, your book does just that. For the record, we had hundreds of hours of conversations with Julie, some which were very difficult and very emotional for us. She also conducted more than 120 interviews, countless hours of research. She visited 6 states, 4 countries, which now brings us here together tonight to celebrate the launching of An Innocent Bystander, the killing of Leon Klinghoffer. What we thought would be an explanation of an ordinary family's nightmare evolved into a meticulously researched snapshot in time. Julie's relentless pursuit of the story within the story of the hijacking of the Achille Lauro and the murder of our father has given us a broader, more universal perspective of this tragic event and all of its ramifications. Through her work, we learned much about this terrible period of time that was never made public, including things that our mother said and did that we never knew. And you will see them too.
We want to thank the Center for Jewish History, the American Jewish Historical Society, and the Village Temple for hosting this evening's program. We especially want to thank Annie Poland and Rabbi Deborah Hirsch for their efforts in making this night so special. We want to thank so many of our relatives, friends, and countless colleagues, others who supported us along this journey our mother began 34 years ago. Your contributions enrich this book immensely. We also want to take a moment to remember with gratitude our family, friends, and colleagues who are no longer with us. Their love and support continue to be an inspiration. Finally, we want to thank Julie for her determination to reveal the story behind the headlines and for her friendship and sensitivity. We wish our mother were here to see this project come to fruition. Julie, she would be very pleased. Thank you.
I have the best sister.
I feel it can only, oh God. I feel like it can only go downhill from here. I just want to say a few thank yous and show you a very short film clip before I invite Warren up to the stage. One thing Annie left out of Warren's bio is that he has a 7-month-old daughter, Abigail. So the fact that he's here tonight is really an incredible act of, I can't say friendship because I don't know you yet, but I'm sure we will be. I just want to, first of all, also thank the Center for Jewish History, my mother, who is here tonight. And you have no idea how much you should be clapping, because her plane from Florida was diverted to Syracuse last night. And through her incredible powers of charm and manipulation, she befriended somebody on the plane who actually brought her home at 1 o'clock in the morning. But one of the things my mom, who, as many of you know, is a survivor of Auschwitz, and throughout my entire life, she inculcated in my sister and me an incredible love of history and an incredible love of storytelling. She is the world's great storyteller. And so I'm sure a lot of my career began with her, along with everything else. But so to have this event here at the Center for Jewish History means so much to me, because I think, not to say I needed validation in the eyes of my mother, but it's an extra validation. As for Annie Polland, I first met her when she was a little pisher 15 years ago at the Eldridge Street Synagogue, when I was doing a story about it for the New York Times, and then I watched her go to the Tenement Museum where she did unbelievable programming, and now she's here. It's so great to have you in the neighborhood. I don't like going too far above 14th Street, so it's excellent. Rabbi Hirsch is, I grew up in a small town in southern Ohio with no Jews, so I didn't really have a rabbi growing up. Now I've learned what it is to have a rabbi, so thank you very much for that, and thank you everybody from the Village Temple who's here tonight. That's great. What Lisa and Elsa didn't tell you is that the original name of this project was Klinghoffer's Daughters, and it was a very long proposal that I think had one paragraph devoted to the hijackers, and it evolved into a very different project. And I kept Lisa and Elsa apprised of what was happening throughout the entire project, and to their incredible credit, I won't say they didn't flinch, they probably flinched, but they never backed off of it. And I think you guys are incredible. Your courage, your willingness to open up your minds to information that you didn't know before. And I will tell you, I spoke to Omar Abbas, the son of Abu al-Abbas, on Sunday, who's also reading the book, and he feels the same back. So it's this very interesting experience that I think it's kind of unfolding as this is happening. Many people in this room were interviewed by me for this book, and I can't thank you enough. I am a royal pain in the neck, I know, but I have I never can remember everything the first time around, so I always have to follow up. My agent, Kathy Robbins, has been with me for 30 years, and she's seen me through a very weird assortment of books, And that has been incredible to have that privilege to be a writer who just does what interests me. And this is my first book with Vanessa Mobley of Little Brown, who's here tonight. And she is an incredible editor and person. And she proves that you don't have to be Jewish to be a mensch, because she certainly is. And she's a gifted, gifted editor. I think everybody should have their books edited by Vanessa, if at all possible. And the Little Brown team has just been amazing. All my friends were here from PS3, from all over. It's just, I'm seeing my worlds converge finally. And finally, my husband, Bill, dragged me into this profession when we were freshmen at Tufts. He was my first editor on the Tufts Observer, my toughest editor then and my toughest editor now, always. And Roxy and Eli, who dressed me for the occasion. My son went with me to Lebanon, and then my daughter went with me to Cuba for reasons that had nothing to do with the book, just R&R. I think they're amazing. And I think those are my thank yous. If I've forgotten anybody, I'll thank you outside. Also, just one little plug. If you buy the book and you read it and you like it, write a review on Amazon and Goodreads. If you don't like it, don't write a review. Okay, so I just want to take you back to the fall of 1985. Leon and Marilyn Klinghoffer were, I was going to say an older couple, but Marilyn was younger than I am. Leon was a little bit older. It's funny how that changes. And they were really ordinary people, which means they were very brave people, because sometimes just to live your life day to day is not the easiest thing. Leon had suffered 2 strokes. He was in a wheelchair, and Marilyn had cancer and was in remission. And this voyage was sort of their way of saying, we're not going to let this get us down. Marilyn was going to be celebrating her birthday. They were celebrating a wedding anniversary. A bunch of their friends, part of this group, the beach people who all went to the beach together in New Jersey, were going to go on, they did go on this cruise together. So they got onto the Achille Lauro, an Italian cruise liner, which Marilyn picked in particular because they didn't use the term there, but it was wheelchair accessible. And then things didn't go quite as they had planned.
Rescue mission would be dangerous but possible. British commandos parachuted onto the Queen Elizabeth II in 1972 when there was a bomb scare in the middle of the Atlantic. Perhaps 12 Palestinian pirates seized the Achille Lauro.
From News Center 7, tonight's Newsbreak is brought to you by Kroger.
Good evening, I'm Jim Baldridge. French and Italian warships are reportedly shadowing that Italian cruise ship hijacked by Palestinian terrorists. 420 persons are aboard. One unconfirmed report says 2 Americans have been killed.
The murder of a 69-year-old disabled passenger from New York City angers America. After a 72-hour siege at sea, negotiations among the PLO, Italy, and Egypt succeed in getting the Achille Lauro back to Egypt. There, the 4 terrorists surrender the ship. At first, the world is led to believe that no one is harmed, so the Palestinians are promised safe passage out of Egypt. But the next day, the truth is learned, and the U.S. ambassador to Egypt makes the announcement. The murder of a 69-year-old disabled passenger from New York City angers America. Americans are outraged when the terrorists are allowed to escape on an Egyptian plane to safe territory in Tunisia. This time, Reagan takes action.
What we want is justice done.
In a flawless execution, U.S. Navy F-14 fighter jets intercept the Egyptian airliner in midair and force it to land at a U.S. base in Sicily.
These young Americans sent a message to terrorists everywhere. The message, you can run, but you can't hide.
Italian courts convict the Palestinian hijackers. But again, the Reagan administration and the public are left dismayed when Italian authorities grant freedom to Abu Alabbas, the man believed to be the brains behind the hijacking.
Responsibility for the hijacking of the Italian cruise ship, the Achille Lauro, but says evidence that his men killed wheelchair-bound Leon Klinghoffer was fabricated by the United States and Syria.
What is the use of killing an old man? Well, after all, he's old and will soon be dead anyway, without killing. I do not believe our comrades on the boat carried out any killing.
Abu Abbas was nearly captured when U.S. fighters forced an Egyptian air jetliner to land in Italy. It was carrying him and the 4 cruise ship hijackers. Over strong American protests, the Italian government permitted him to flee to Yugoslavia. Like so many battling in the Middle East, he does not see himself as a terrorist.
The Palestinian is accused everywhere, hunted everywhere, and is the terrorist everywhere. This is the picture that Americans have. In fact, the Palestinian is a homeless refugee, without the right to a passport, without the right to visit his village or birthplace or even his father's grave. The Palestinian has lived in a state of subjugation and oppression for 40 years. Is he now the terrorist?
Abu Abbas has several camps in the Mideast and is believed to control about 1,200 guerrillas, a number of them prepared to carry out suicide missions. Although on the run, he told us he is being financed by several countries and is free to travel in order to carry out his long fight against Israel and now America.
I was waiting because we actually had a third clip about Alex O'Dell that didn't show, but it's okay. There's a third piece of the story, as the rabbi said, after Abu Abbas. Alex O'Dell was a Palestinian peace activist. Really, the Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee that he ran in California was modeled actually on the ADL, on the Anti-Defamation League, protecting the civil rights of Arabs and the image in the media. And so that became another piece of the story that I only barely knew when I wrote that initial proposal. So Warren, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. I'm taking off my watch just to keep an eye on the time. The way we've been asked to structure this is that Julie and I will talk until about 8 o'clock. And at some point, members of Annie's staff will be circulating cards or have already done so for your questions. And at some point, they'll be brought up to us, and we'll discuss those starting at a few minutes after 8, and we'll wind down at about 8:20. Something that I was just struck by coming in here is something that I suspect everyone was struck by, was having to come to this type of an event and walk through metal detectors is on some level quite unnerving, and it may be necessary, but I hope we don't ever get to the point where that's considered normal. Something else that I'll just briefly mention before turning to Julie is just the incredible work that the Klinghoffer family has done in preserving the legacy of both Leon and Marilyn Klinghoffer. When I had an earlier stint in my career where I worked on the staff of the 9/11 Commission, which had a mandate to ensure not only that the American public had some sense of what had happened as a result of the terrorism in September 2001, but also to find recommendations to ensure that it never happened again. And that commission would just never have existed if it was not for the persistence and determination of the family members who lost loved ones on 9/11. And in meeting the Klinghoffer sisters tonight, I can see the exact same glint in their eye and determination that no is never an acceptable answer. Julie, you have written a wide variety of books. The first one that I read was The Devil's Candy, which is about the making of The Bonfire of the Vanities, which is a tremendous novel and a just god-awful movie. You've also written about Wendy Wasserstein, about the insanity defense. Sorry, I've been home caring for a 6-7-year-old. A 7-month-old, excuse me, and I have already, this whole day has been a lesson in the determination of female Jewish determination. It sort of starts very young. Let me ask you how you came, given this, this diversity of interests, including a lot of Hollywood stuff you've written about Christmas. Your last 2 books were children's books. How did you come to this one?
Well, it really began the way that that Annie and Lisa and Elsa described it. We came to the event here at the Center for Jewish History about where Lisa and Elsa actually, I think, were trained by a producer from the Moth Theater Company, and they told their story almost as a piece of theater. And then they had a pilot, Larry Neal, who had been one of the pilots that helped bring down the plane that forced the hijackers to land in Italy. And they had Sarah Reimer, who was a reporter for the New York Times, who wrote about the Klinghoffer family, and it was riveting. And I just thought, I mean, I'm always got my antenna up for what my next project is and what exactly it is that draws you to a particular subject. It's hard to know, but I think in this case, I think that whole idea of an ordinary family being caught up in the rush of history is something that certainly has appealed to has been pertinent to my own family's life. Another book I wrote was The Net of Dreams, which was about my parents' odyssey from the Carpathian Mountains to the Appalachian foothills. So that's a subject that is very moving to me. And one other thing, there is something about that runs very strongly through all of the books is sort of the concept of community and family, even though it may not be readily apparent. But even in The Devil's Candy, which the book was about this world that's created around making a movie. And the same with the Wendy Wasserstein book. All of those books have that common theme, I think.
You mentioned Sarah Reimer, who's the New York Times reporter who is put onto this story. And in the book, you tell what it's, I think you're a former Wall Street Journal reporter, so we can, those of us still at the paper are quelling about this. You lay out what, for reporters, is something that they've all faced, is the scene where she is actually told by her editor she doesn't want to intrude on the Klinghoffer family who are just finding out that Leon has been murdered, and is sent back up by her editor, says, no, get back up, go into the apartment, right, where she's actually welcomed by the Klinghoffer family, who recognize this is an opportunity to tell their story. It's an awkward place for any reporter who is trying to sort of wrestle with the duty between wanting to get the story, but also trying to be a decent human being at the same point in time, and there is sometimes some tension between the two. How did you grapple with that and sort of getting involved in such a painful and personal story?
So I think I kind of rush into things in a headlong way without worrying about all of that until I'm in it so deep that I can't really think about it. And I think in this case it was particularly complicated because I knew Lisa and Elsa from our synagogue. Jerry and I had been co-president of the synagogue together, so while at the time we weren't what I would call close friends, we were certainly very close, friendly acquaintances. And I just felt that I took a leap. And I think I also had an instinct about them at this program that they were talking, that they seemed to be people who were seekers of the truth. And you know, again, not to keep dragging my mother into this, but she's always such a good prop. Mom. But, you know, she has always amazed me throughout my lifetime of the way she's been able to talk about her experiences and to talk about her life in a way as though it's not happening to her. And I probably have inherited a little bit of that seeing things through a bubble, which I think is pretty common among reporters. You know, we're it's a little scary sometimes because that sheepish thing you said, kind of, I cringe when you say that because I know I do it, but it's not meant to be a ruse. It just sometimes feels like it.
What can you tell us about the reporting process, about where it took you both emotionally and physically? How long did it take you to do this? Where did you go?
That's a long, okay, I'll try to make it as short as possible. So let's do physically first because that's easier. So the book took me to a lot of really interesting places. Probably the most exotic for me was to Lebanon. I ultimately went to Lebanon to interview Reem al-Nimr, who was the second wife of Abu Alabbas. And I went, my son Eli, who's here tonight, accompanied me on the trip. He was between school and work, and so it seemed like a good idea. And I will tell one interesting story that happened there. So I've been to Israel many times in my life, but my passport did not have an Israel stamp, which will keep you out of Lebanon. And now in Israel, they don't stamp your passport anymore. They stamp a piece of paper and put it aside. But we got to the customs, and this very, stern customs official, a young guy, says to me, he starts looking through my passport. I've traveled a lot, so he's looking. Finally, he puts it down. He says, "Have you ever been to Israel?" So do I lie? I'm a terrible liar. So I thought, what if they have it in the computer? So I thought, no, I'm going to tell him the truth. So I said, yes. And I said, but it was a very long time ago. Meantime, Eli, my son, is looking daggers at me like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you just lie? And so, then he looks at me and he says, have you been to Israel in this passport? I said, no, I haven't been to Israel in this passport. He stamps it, goes out. Reem picks us up, and she says two things. You are so lucky you didn't get a Hamas guy, she said, because you'd be on the plane back to New York. And the second thing she said, this happened to be the day that Hariri, the prime minister of Lebanon, had gone off to Saudi Arabia, and it felt for a minute like there might be a war or something. And she says,
you got kidnapped by
Mohammed
bin Salman,
right.
the Saudi crown prince.
And she says, you picked the worst time ever to come to Lebanon. And I thought, really, I don't think so. I mean, Lebanon it's always the worst time.
This book takes us back, and just looking at the footage, to an earlier era of terrorism, something that's very different from the post-9/11 world. Brian Jenkins from the Rand Corporation famously said that terrorism is theater. And in 1975, 10 years before the events that you chronicle at the beginning of this book, he said, terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. Now, that's a much earlier era. Today, obviously, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they certainly want a lot of people watching, but they're also perfectly happy to have a lot of people dead. What do you think we learn in this post-9/11 era from looking back at this earlier period in the evolution of terrorism?
Well, I think, especially for younger people, I think the fact that there was an earlier period in the evolution of terrorism is a really valuable lesson. I mean, history, especially in today's world when nothing is put into context, when everything is a tweet, when everything is so reductive, I think the fact that actually what we see today in the world of terrorism is part of a long stream. And I think the other thing that I found so fascinating in reporting the book is to look at the U.S. government's policies and attitudes and responses, and then to kind of see how it looks from the other point of view, which is certainly something that's happened since 9/11. But there's a point in the book, Reagan came into office in 1980, partly on an obviously anti-Soviet was his big stance, but also anti-terrorism because of the Iranian hostage situation. And then in 1983, the bombing of the Marine barracks in Lebanon, and it wasn't going so well for him, the war against terrorism. And then when the Achille Lauro came along, this was a way to sort of have a victory. And just one other thing, though, that, throughout the Lebanese Civil War, U.S. military gunboats were offshore, and they're kind of lobbying. There were actually incredible reportage about that. Tom Friedman, all these people were reporting about this. We're lobbing missiles into Lebanon, and they're blowing up a lot of people who are civilians. And so it helps you start to understand, like, why do they hate us? Because we're killing people who are sometimes very innocent bystanders as well. And I think that throughout the history of our foreign policy, we don't look so much, or we haven't historically looked so much at the reaction on the other side.
Also, just to take the thread through, in 1983, when the Marine barracks is bombed in Beirut, the Reagan administration cuts and runs and pulls them out very quickly. George Shultz, the Secretary of State, says it's the worst day of his entire life. George Shultz is also, by the end of the Reagan administration, he is authorized by President Reagan to the first time directly open up a official U.S. diplomatic dialogue directly with the PLO. Does this book sort of help explain some of that arc and transition?
Definitely. I mean, I think that throughout the course of the story of the Achille Lauro, you see the changing attitudes of the PLO as well. And also, I'm not saying that the PLO is exactly the shining example of good government and diplomacy, because while Arafat is having diplomatic peace discussions with the West, he has Abu Alabbas and the PLF doing acts of, they call them military operations, but acts of terrorism, because I think he was trying to play to all sides of his, to his base and his base and his base. The PLO is a complicated organization. It's an umbrella organization with many, many factions.
Right, which for Arafat is sometimes convenient.
That's
that he
right.
has semi-plausible deniability and issues some condemnatory statements about the Achille Lauro at the same time that he's not exactly lily white of hand himself.
Of course, and in fact there's a point in the book where he has a discussion with Abu Alabbas about something that he's supposed to do, but you can't mention my name, Arafat says to him directly.
Let me ask you sort of about what you've learned about what the hijackers thought that they were doing when they took over the boat, because we know how this story ends, but what you do is sort of take us through all of the chaos and improvisation that these young guys, some of them not particularly talented, 4 people on one boat. What did they think they were doing, and what is the original plan, and what happens to it?
Right, so I think that's the other thing that's so instructive about this, because I think a lot of times we look at these acts of terrorism and think, oh, these are such meticulously planned operations. Sometimes they're luck, bad luck if you're on the wrong side of it, and many times they're just ineptly thought through. So in this case, these 4 young guys were part of the PLF. Their mission in their mind at that time was to infiltrate Israel. Israel was the impregnable place. They felt that they had been displaced from their homeland. That, a story which continues today. This is an issue that's never been resolved. And they thought that they were using the Achille Lauro as a taxi, basically. They got on in Genoa as passengers. They went shopping. I mean, there's a scene when the 4 of them go out to buy their tourist clothes. And Abu Alabbas sent these 4 young guys, aged 17 to 23, for several weeks to Italy. They don't speak a word of Italian, and there were no cell phones, so they have to communicate in these really haphazard ways on finding payphones and codes, and it was very, they were terrified basically before they got on the boat, and they boarded the ship. You talk about the security here. There was no security. I don't even think airplanes had security yet in the 80s, but they certainly didn't on passenger ships, so they had in their suitcases their AK-47s. And they got on the ship, and their idea was to take the ship. It was going to a couple of stops in Italy, and then it was going to stop in, they stopped in Egypt, and eventually they were going to go to Ashdod in Israel. And their idea was they were going to get off the boat in Ashdod, and they were going to shoot up the port, and they expected to be killed. They assumed that this was going to be a suicide mission because they couldn't really think about how they had no exit plan. And what happened on the 2nd or 3rd day of the voyage, that they didn't realize that when you're on a passenger ship, people come into your cabin to clean it a couple of times a day, and they thought they were being spied on. And so they freaked out, and that's when they decided to hijack the ship. Most of the passengers had gotten off at the ship in Alexandria, Egypt, because they were going to go tour the pyramids, and the only people on the ships were people who were there were a couple of little kids, people who didn't feel well, people who had been to the pyramids before, or people like Leon Klinghoffer who couldn't make the trip. And so it was, if it hadn't been such a horrible tragedy, it would have been like the Keystone Cops. They really didn't quite know what they were doing. And I honestly believe that 3 out of the 4 hijackers had no idea that Leon Klinghoffer was killed by Mulkey, who was the leader, the 23-year-old leader, who just kind of, who knows, in all of his different testimony, we will never know exactly why he did it, but it was definitely not part of the plan.
So to be clear, the plan in some sense is even more murderous. That
Oh,
this
definitely. More people would have been killed, but it wouldn't have become a news event in the United States. That's sort of the irony of it. I mean, it would have been a one-day news event, but nothing like what happened with Leon Klinghoffer, because he was an American. And he was in a wheelchair. It was horrible. You know, it was just the image and the thought, somebody so defenseless. But, and the truth is, they probably wouldn't have succeeded in Ashdod. They probably would have been, you know, the Israeli security was pretty tight. I don't think they would have had much of a chance.
Let me read you from something that I found while getting ready for this talk, which is a still current FBI Most Wanted poster, which says, on October 11th, 1985, Alexander Michel ODell was killed when a bomb exploded at the office of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee at 1905 East 17th Street in Santa Ana, California. He was killed when he unlocked and opened the door of the ADC's office at approximately 9 a.m. In addition to killing ODell, the bomb injured several other people and caused massive damage to the building. That's still current. That's an unsolved crime.
Yes.
Why? Tell us a little about this and why it's in this book.
So the Alex ODell story is in this book because many of the FBI officials at the time thought that his murder was caused by the Jewish Defense League, which is a right-wing terror organization. And what happened was, because Alex ODell, just as the ADL is often called on to comment about various atrocities that happen against synagogues or things that happen in Israel or whatever, the Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee was called on to comment about the Achille Lauro. So he was in LA, the local ABC affiliate called up Alex ODell for comment. And just to back up for a minute, the offices of the Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee have been targeted for several months. Before that, with various acts of violence, often by the JDL or just random. I mean, we think random crazy people killing people is something that's a phenomenon of now. It's been going on forever in this country. It's a very violent, strange place we live in, and it's happened over and over again throughout our history. And so Alex's wife, who was 27 years old, they had 3 young kids, little girls, begged him not to go on television because they had already been receiving, after Leon Klinghoffer's death, threatening phone calls. And he said, no, it's going to be fine. So he went on. He was interviewed by the reporter. He expressed sympathy and horror at the killing of Leon Klinghoffer. And then he was asked if he thought Yasser Arafat had anything to do with it. And at that time, the prevailing wisdom was no, because Arafat condemned it. And he said, no, he would never do that. He's a man of peace, because that's when these peace. So the next day, he went into his office, and it was blown up. And so I think that whether there was never direct causality proved, but I felt that it was widely believed to have been connected to Leon Klinghoffer's death. And I think for his family, they felt very wounded. They didn't get the call from President Reagan. They didn't get the big newspaper stories. They were just, it was just sort of reported, and it was treated as a local murder, basically. And so Michael Bone, who was actually the head of the White House security team at the time, wrote a book several years ago in which he talked about the Alex ODell case. That's where I had first heard about it. And his point, because he was writing after 9/11, is that he was really writing about domestic terror. You know, that while we're talking about, there's all kinds of terrorism. And that was sort of the point of his book. And that was sort of what led me to Alex Oda, and then, as Rabbi Hirsch said, it led me to the families, because ultimately one of the things I wanted to look at was all of these families, the Oda family, Abu Alabbas' family, and certainly the Klinghoffer family. You have this legacy that you're left with, and of how to deal with it. How do you deal with this, with the fighting, with the being a victim, being part of this craziness, and yet you're still, in the case of all of the women involved, you're still raising your kids. And it was crazy to me that in the middle of all this, Rimal Niemer is trying to figure out, she enrolls her kids always in French lycées because she knew they'd keep having to move, but they'd have a consistency of education.
This is Abu Abbas.
This is Abu Alabbas. And with the ODell family, I think they just feel like they're American citizens. Alex ODell was an American citizen, naturalized. He was born in Palestine before Israel became independent, but then became a citizen here. And I think they felt like, are we citizens or are we second-class citizens? Because they felt they weren't accorded equal respect or care.
So something that's central to the book is this attempt, as you say, to try to find these human narratives locked in these political machinations, and you're very concerned with the human storytelling, which leads me to not to terrorism as theater, but to terrorism as opera. There is this opera called "The Death of Klinghoffer," which becomes an important flashpoint in this story. Edward Said, you wrote, thought that it stacked the deck against some of the banal American Jews who were off on this vacation in its libretto, and you note that Lisa Klinghoffer, while she was seeing it for the first time, thought, do you admire these people or don't you? Do you feel for these people or don't you? I will say, since we're both Wall Street Journal people, the Wall Street Journal's critic absolutely hated the thing. What did you make of it, and how do you see it fitting into this wider story?
So for those of you who don't know about the opera, although I'm sure most of the people here do, this opera came out originally in 1991. It was really 6 years later, and so this event was still very fresh in people's mind. And the original opera did have, you know, it's funny seeing so it had a scene that showed it wasn't the Klinkhoffers, but the friends of the Klinkhoffers getting ready to go on the cruise. And it's not a very flattering scene, although interestingly enough, this scene
It's really mean.
Yeah, it's mean, but the truth is, if you think about it, it came out just when Seinfeld was coming out. It was that kind of caustic humor, but it's basically just not very well done. And they took it out of the opera.
No one gets killed in Seinfeld.
No. Well, I think they do sometimes, but I'm not sure.
All right, George's fiance, yes.
But I think that. But I do think that when the reaction came to that scene, John Adams had it taken out of the opera. So by the time the opera opened here in 2014, which is when I first saw it, that offending scene no longer existed. And yet that second iteration of the opera here in New York was the one that evoked all of this protest. Incredible protest. Rudy Giuliani leading the band of people in wheelchairs saying, "I am Leon Klinghoffer," and none of them had seen the opera. And that actually may have been when I started getting interested in this story, because the thing I hate more than anything is when people say they don't like something they haven't seen. It makes me crazy. And so I think that whether you like the opera or you don't, I think that once that scene was taken out, the opera became certainly not anti-Semitic. And I think most people agreed about that after the scene was taken out. I will say that the opera was written by Alice Goodman, who was going through her own meshigas at the time, because she was from a pretty observant Jewish family, I think in Milwaukee, and she was in the process of becoming an Episcopal priest. She's now living in England, and so I think a lot of that scene was about her own family. That's just my armchair psychology. I don't put that in the book, but I thought that for me, the opera was sort of an important piece of the story because it reintroduced the Klinghoffer story to the public, but I also thought the way that it became theater within theater, you know, the sort of fighting about the opera that was taking place the first time around was, to me, a legitimate discussion because it was people who had seen it. It was mostly critics and writers, and some liked it and some hated it, and that seemed good. The second time around, it was mostly people protesting something that they hadn't seen. They didn't know what was in it, and they just wanted, it was, to me, a sign of our much more heightened, unforgiving, hysterical times that we live in.
So let me, and we're going to turn to your questions pretty soon, and cue cards I think will somehow materialize up here. And if people have questions and there's someone in the aisle waving if you want one. Just to quickly turn to Abu Alabbas, who is the PLF leader, the mastermind behind this murderous operation, and who has, as Vanessa Mobley pointed out to me, who has the very strange accident, through the cunning of history, he winds up ultimately in Baghdad and is captured after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and dies in U.S. custody in March 2004 at Camp Cropper, the U.S. facility near the Baghdad International Airport, seemingly after a heart attack, which is something bizarre, that he dies in American custody, seemingly of natural causes. What kind of a person was the mastermind behind this operation that was murderous, that was supposed to be even more murderous, and winds up leading the murder of an old man in a wheelchair?
Let's just say it's complicated. I went into this project thinking he must be like a devil, right? You know, Abu Alabbas. And then I meet both of his wives. He married two fabulous women, really intelligent, really interesting, really sort of, I don't know what I expected, but something different. And he had five sons, 3 of his sons and 2 stepsons, none of whom have followed in his footsteps. And I sort of feel like he was somebody who went into the wrong profession. All of his famous missions were disasters. None of them worked. They were these sort of very romanticized ideas, but he was obsessed with penetrating the Israeli firewall. He wanted to land in Israel, and the plans he came up with for people to do that always failed because they made no sense. And yet I think he was a really smart guy, and actually, to bring it back to the Wall Street Journal, my roots, Tony Horowitz, who sadly just died a couple of weeks ago, wrote an incredibly great piece, because I thought, am I crazy that I'm finding this guy sort of interesting, Abu Alabbas? And Tony interviewed him when he was a reporter in Iraq in the early 90s. And it was clear from Tony's article that he kind of liked him too. You know, that he was, you know, they sat there and drank tea and discussed Shakespeare, and it wasn't quite what he expected. So I got in touch with Tony and interviewed him for the book. And Tony said, yeah, it was just this very disconcerting experience that I just think he went in, I think through the, through the forces of history, he just ended up in the wrong profession, and it was a murderous profession. But I think a lot of it, I just think people, I think he was different. You can say, well, Hitler loved his dog, but I don't think he was like that. I think he was a person who sincerely believed in the cause of his people. And I think he thought of himself as a revolutionary and a freedom fighter. And he felt that he was desperate. So very complicated, but ultimately I think not that great at what he was trying to do.
Let's be glad he wasn't better at it.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'll turn now to some terrific questions from the audience. Thank you very much. We won't be able to get to all of them, but Julie, I think, will be hanging around afterwards, and we'll be glad to chat with any sign books, sell books, these sorts of things. We have one person out there who should really be in my line of work. This is someone who is very attuned to language, who says that no one has used the word killing tonight and that we have mostly been using the word murder. And says, so why is the title of the book, the subtitle, The Killing of Leon Klinghoffer?
Right, that's a great question. So we kind of went back and forth on it with Vanessa. Should it be the killing of, should it be the murder? Originally we were thinking of the death, but the opera already took that. For me, the killing of Leon Klinghoffer, if you say it's the murder, to me it sounded more like a procedural, that this is somehow a detective story, that this is to try to look at this as a criminal investigation, whereas the killing looked at the whole process. Because the killing of Leon Klinghoffer wasn't just the moment that Moltke shot him, it was all of the events, the geopolitical situation, the history of all these people that brought it to there. And so I think for me, killing had a broader meaning than just murder would have.
And am I overreading to think that the ripples on the cover are sort of suggestive of the ripples throughout the book and the ripples outward from this episode, or?
Well, I like that. Lucy Kim, the cover designer for Little Brown, this is, I think, the first time ever somebody has just sent me a cover of a book that I said, oh my God, that is beautiful. So yeah, I like that. I'm going to use that, Warren. Yes, the ripple effects, the ripples on the book are all the ripple effects of everything that happened.
So having asked one question about the subtitle, someone also has a question about the title, An Innocent Bystander, and says, who are the innocents? It's not Alabbas, is it Alex ODell? Is it the wives of the killers? Is it anyone beyond just Leon Klinghoffer? And if so, as you are writing this, how do you keep some sense of moral equilibrium? Surely there is no equivalence between the murder of Leon Klinghoffer and the dislocations that are suffered by even the wives who you quite liked of the terrorists.
No.
How do you balance that?
No, of course not. You know, this term moral equivalency is something that comes up quite a bit, and it's a term that I actually don't like, no offense to whoever wrote the question, because I think it becomes sort of an excuse to not listen to other sides of a story. And so I think nobody, including the family of Abu Alabbas, would say that there was any justification for killing Leon Klinghoffer, for murdering Leon Klinghoffer. And I certainly think that no, but I think it's possible to have varying degrees of harm done to people and to explore them without saying that they're all equal. I don't think the book ever says that. And I think that if you only, I think part of the problem is if you only look at one specific incident and say, this is a horrible act, this is terrible, and now we're not going to even listen to anything else, then we're where we are and where we have been, just completely riding the same train over and over again.
So just to sort of, on behalf of the cue card, just to push you a little further
Sure.
on this, your argument is that you can still have the narrative complexity of looking at all these different people without having to totally let your moral sense fall out.
No, of course not. I mean, I don't think anybody should kill anybody, ever. And so, do I think it was right? I think Moltke was an insane person. Do I think these 4 guys should have hijacked the Achille Lauro and shot guns in the ballroom and terrified people? Of course not. But I also think that if you don't look at why they were there and what led them there and what their motivation was, then what are you going to ever learn? If everything is just about crime and punishment and not looking at the root causes of things, then we're never going to get anywhere. And that's not only with terrorism, it's with our own incarceration system, it's with a lot of different things. A receptive audience.
There we go.
The innocent, oh, I think Leon Klinghoffer was an innocent bystander. I think that, who asked?
And we'll try
Oh,
to
I'm not
keep
supposed, oh, sorry, I'm
this
not
up here.
supposed to do that. I think Leon Klinghoffer was very much an innocent. I think there are a lot of innocent bystanders. But I will have that conversation with you after you read the book. That's what I just said.
So the next question from the audience is, did the murderers of Leon Klinghoffer ultimately receive any degree of justice?
Say it again.
Did the killers of Leon Klinghoffer receive any degree of justice?
Justice. Well, you're going to have to talk to the rabbi about justice and what that is. If you mean, were they punished? Yes. They received punishment for their crimes. They were tried in a court of law in Italy. I was very fortunate to be able to get the entire trial transcript, have it translated and read it, and it is an absolutely riveting document. Because at the time, the court in Italy went through this incredibly fascinating philosophical and legal discussion about the difference between murder and terrorism. And one of the big questions in terms, they all spent jail time to answer your, the immediate question, but one of the questions in the trial was this a killing and a joint effort, and were they terrorists? Was this a bande de terrorists? And the court actually at that time ruled that they were not, because at that time Italy was very sympathetic to the PLO, and the court decreed, and it was a very tough, and they got very severe sentences for Italy. I mean, where Italy has a very different view of incarceration than we do in this country, but they did not say they were terrorists, interestingly enough. They said that that Moltke was a murderer and the others were accomplices.
The next question, I think might have been sent by Annie Polland, but it asks, what role do archives play in journalistic endeavors?
I love you, Annie. What role do archives play? I think archives are incredible, and I actually use 3 very important archives. You know, I never did answer your original question about the reporting process. So in addition to doing all the interviews, the beginning of the reporting process happened here. I interviewed Joel Levy, who was fascinating because he was stationed in Malta at the time in the State Department, and you should talk to him because he has some riveting stories to tell about that. But I spent the first couple of weeks of my research here in this incredible archive, reading every single piece of paper there was to read about Leon Klinghoffer, every condolence card. I will say, just to take you back to 1985 before email, one of the most moving things in the archive are literally hundreds and hundreds of handwritten letters and cards that people from all over the world sent to Marilyn Klinghoffer after Leon Klinghoffer died. These were strangers, and it's just mind-blowing to think that people were so taken by this story that they did that. And you can only see that in an archive where you can actually see the paper. So that was one piece of the research. The other was the ADL archive, which was also incredibly helpful. I know they're in the process of organizing it a little better, which it could use. It's not quite as well organized as the Center for Jewish History, but it was a rich archive that had so much information about it. And then the third archive, which was mind-blowing, was the Reagan Library in Northern California, where there are thousands of documents about the Achille Lauro. And the most fascinating document I saw from there, and I have a picture of it on my phone, was a little memo from Oliver North, who at the time was a young officer working in the counterterrorism unit in the White House. And it was just when news of Iran-Contra was starting to filter out, and he wrote a little handwritten note. People are so stupid. It's unbelievable what they write. He wrote a little note saying, we have to make this Achille Lauro rescue operation work to divert attention from Iran-Contra. It's like, Oliver, stupid. And you can only see that in an archive. or on my phone.
So I will just add that the second part of that question was just to ask, is it common among journalists to draw on archives? And I think we can both say, tragically, it is
No.
not, but...
Only if they get a good book contract with Vanessa.
Yes, but there are incredible... Steve Call, my old boss at the Washington Post, has done an incredible job of using recently released archival material in Ghost Wars, which won the Pulitzer Prize, which is about Afghanistan and U.S. policy there. It's incredible, the stuff that is in there, and I hope that this book does encourage more of our brethren to actually get into the archives and get dust on them. Someone asked, at what point did you, well, we've sort of covered that. How did you organize the numerous interviews that you used for the book? Did you more or less insert the material into pre-existing sections that you had prepared and used them, or was it more of a stream of consciousness which directed the writing?
Yes, no. So the real answer to that is, I have to say, Max Klinghoffer Doran, Elsa's son and Paul's, I interviewed him for the book, and I asked him what he wanted to know about the grandfather he never met. And he said, I want to know the tick-tock. He said, I want to know everything that happened. And that just sort of became imprinted in my brain, the tick-tock. And so as an organizing principle, time became my guide. So the book is divided into, the first half takes place in 2 weeks, the second quarter takes place in 1 year, and the next quarter takes place in 20 years. So it's like life, it speeds up as you go along. And I think
it's like
what I was...
Christopher Nolan movie.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that as I was writing the book, I have all these little folders in my computer, and so originally they're divided by, a bus and by Klinghoffer and by the different topics, but ultimately when I started writing each chapter, I would just sort of turn my office into a very scary place and have, I'm sad to say, paper all over the floor of everything that was related to that chapter. And then I know you want some logical response to this, but honestly, a lot of the book gets written while I'm walking the dog. You're just walking the dog, and then all of a sudden you go home and you write it. So get a dog if you want to write.
Tough night for cat people.
That's good. I had cats too.
So we're coming towards the end, and I've got two questions that I'm going to slightly blend, but they're more or less on the same theme, which is to try to get you to reflect a little bit about terrorism today, to reflect both about what it looks like in its foreign variant, and to get you to think a little about what it reflects in its domestic variant in the wake of Charlottesville and President Trump's remarks about there being very fine people on both sides, one of those sides being a rally of neo-Nazis. Do you have some sense of how this book informs how we should think about the current state of terrorism, both domestic in its white supremacist manifestation, and in the post 9/11 version of Islamist terrorism?
So I'm going to divide that into two pieces. I think in one part of it is to look at, I think, a huge difference, at least in the Middle East, between terrorism in the era of the Achille Lauro and terrorism today is that it has become so much more religion-based now. The PLO at that time was pretty secular. In fact, Abu Alabbas, his first wife was Christian, Palestinian, his second wife was a Muslim, and he was not at all a religious person. And I'm not bad-talking religion, Rabbi, but I would sort of think a little reform would be a good thing. And so I think that was a big shift, but I think part of what the book shows is a lot of that shift came because of the inability of all sides at that time to try to understand what was going on. I mean, within the Reagan administration, there was not, to me, something maybe looking at it in retrospect, the attitudes towards what was going on in the Middle East were so informed by the larger battle with the Soviet Union and the whole Iran-Iraq war that was going on, where we were playing both sides against the middle. I mean, there are fascinating documents that show, you know, Reagan writing a apology letter to Saddam Hussein for selling these arms to Iran, which they weren't supposed to be doing because we were supposed to be neutral. So if nothing else, I think looking back at this history sees we may think things are horrible now and that people behave poorly now, but even Reagan was nicer and a better speaker and a more genial person, and I think by far a more thoughtful leader. But in terms of policy, you know, I'm not talking about Trump, because Trump I don't think has policy, but I mean in terms of thinking about things that way, I think it's worthwhile to look at history and to see how these decisions were made, because a lot of times I don't know if they were made that thoughtfully. You had Schultz and Weinberger at each other's throats. They hated each other. They were making alternate decisions. So in that respect, but I do think the failure of coming to some kind of peace accord in the Middle East at that era when you had a chance with a secular population is, and the failure of leadership was on both sides, I think is much worse now. The lessons to learn, if I could solve the issue of terrorism now, then forget it. I'm not sitting here, I'm going to Stockholm and picking up my Nobel Peace Prize because I think that's a big ask.
Well, this is, there are many more questions that we could get to. It is a book that lends itself, it offers some answers, it offers a lot of questions. We could go all night. For now, let me thank, in particular, the Klinghoffer family for bringing us all together. And let me thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Julie Solomon.
And thank you, Warren.
And please join me in thanking Warren Bass. I can't think of a better interlocutor for this book. When the American Jewish Historical Society was founded in 1892, here in New York City, I think it was June 6th, and we have a transcript of their first meeting because they were historians, so they kept a transcript of their meeting. And one of the things they said in the meeting was that the creation of a historical society, an American Jewish Historical Society, and by the way, this was the first time any ethnic or cultural or religious group formed a historical society in this country, they hoped that the society and the study of history would dispel prejudice. So 127 years later, we haven't yet succeeded in dispelling prejudice, but our goal is to aggregate and bring together the stories that help us interpret and bring light to history, and therefore illuminating better paths for conversation and moving forward. I think if the founders of the American Jewish Historical Society were here today, they would agree with me that Julie Solomon wins like the Star Pupil Award in taking material and really giving it new life. And I want to thank her for that, and again, thank the Klinghoffer family for bringing the archives to us. And we're so honored to have this responsibility of caring for them. I won't require each and every one of you to go into our archives and write a book, although I did write that question. Warren was right. But I do hope that this is not the only time you come to the American Jewish Historical Society or for the Center for Jewish History, and that we can help you in your own research. We can help you learn more about history through coming on our walking tours, our films, our book reviews. We'll be launching a new exhibit on Emma Lazarus in December, on December 3rd, which is the anniversary of when her poem was read aloud at an auction. And this would be the poem, the new Colossus, that would go on to the Statue of Liberty. And these words are important for us to listen to study, and to interpret. So again, I don't require you to write a book, but I do require you to take part, and I do hope you'll become members of the American Jewish Historical Society. This does not happen just based on ideas alone. Resources are needed, and we need to expand our community to keep doing this work, which I think is really important. So I want to thank you for coming tonight, and I do hope you'll become part of our community, and I want to thank Village Temple in sponsoring the wonderful reception that awaits us. Julie Salomon will be available to sign the books that are on sale at a table right outside. So please, thank you for coming tonight.